We will now move straight into our first panel discussion for this afternoon, which will focus on the ways digital services, namely e-commerce, may be deployed and what impact they can bring. The panel will also look a bit further ahead on what upcoming new regulations and services will bring to the market and to society in the near future.
Our first panelist is Riccardo Genghini from eWitness Malta Ltd. For over a decade, Mr. Genghini has been actively engaged in the protection of the consumer and privacy in telecommunications and IT, and in the protection of the fundamental rights of the individual in a free, pluralistic and digital society.
The second panelist, yes, applause. The second panelist is Calvin Briffa. A CEO of Born Digital, a local development agency specializing in e-commerce services, Calvin is an expert in understanding how web users behave. He consults on website strategies targeting different audiences.
The third panelist is Lucrecia Dufoo from the Point Shopping Mall. Lucrecia's areas of expertise include driving marketing strategy through insight and analytics. She is head of marketing at Tinja Mall, managing communications, PR, and customer experience management.
The fourth panelist, Ian Gauci, who is the managing partner of GTG Advocates and Affiliation Alliance. He advises multiple government bodies and operators on various laws and other issues.
And Joseph Seikel from the MCA will be moderating this discussion. Joseph manages the MCA's digital services regulatory program covering various digital aspects including e-commerce, trust services and web accessibility.
So good afternoon, everyone. So we've heard a lot already on the opportunities that digital will bring to society at large, but also, of course, the threats that we can expect and which we should keep tabs on. Since the MCA was established back in the early 2000s, really, we've always aimed to help local businesses tap into these opportunities by adopting a forward-looking regulatory approach that aims to ensure that these opportunities are not stifled. As Bernard mentioned, in fact, just a few moments ago, we are now seeing a significant shift, though, in customer expectations, in types of businesses, how we are trying to view them, increasing complexity in systems, and, of course, new regulations that are coming in. To help us understand the value digital services within the MCA's remit, in this case, can bring, and what challenges one typically encounters in real life, when going or operating in a digital environment. And perhaps most importantly, what opportunities one can expect to tap into through digital services now and as we speak. We've come up with this panel discussion that comprises panelists with whom we've worked already over the past few years. These are typically digital service providers whom we regulate to different extents, and also seasoned professionals that are active in the digital sector. The audiences, of course, you're invited to put forward any comments or questions that you may have. So perhaps we can start with Lucrecia. Lucrecia is a recent graduate of ours of the eBusinify e-commerce training program. Through eBusinify, we managed, or we try to address a gap that we've seen over the past few years, whereby we're seeing the skills gap that is related to going online. And we like to think that through eBusinify, we are turning attendees into e-commerce experts. And Lucrecia, in fact, is one expert that we have with us today. Lucrecia, first of all, what is your feedback in general on eBusinify, and how has it helped you in your line of work?
I found the course very interesting and very easy to read and easy to follow. The first thing that I can say about the course is that it takes you from the very basic, so you have an idea or you have a business, and you are driven and taken step by step on how to get that business online. You are taught how to see the aspects of data analytics, see the aspects of design, see the aspects of customer experience, there is every single step of the customer journey that is touched through the program. The program is a very practical program. It's difficult to find the time to sit down in the afternoons and just read and read. So this program will take you through practical sessions, forums where you can discuss with your colleagues what is your idea and how you are going to bring it online. And the most important part is that if today we are going to talk about, for example, creating a website, your assignment for this session will be actually creating a website. So there is no time to be shy. There is no time to say, oh, well, I don't know if I can do it. You have to do it. You are pushed in a very positive way to say, I can do it and I will learn these skills and I will apply them every day. And I can say that many of the skills that I learned in the program, I use them every single day nowadays. Thanks to this program, I am more confident and I feel much safer in the approach and in the decisions that I take during my work nowadays.
That's the spirit we'd like to see, really. So from our market research, we are seeing these ideas of related to, for instance, the user journey personalization and multi-channel experience and so forth. From your experience, how do your customers view or use your online services rather than view?
Well, in our case, I work for a shopping mall, so our experience, it's a very interesting experience. We aim for people to come and have the physical experience. However, we cannot afford not to be online. We cannot afford not to tell our customers what is happening in there. And we even have some e-commerce visibility because people can buy vouchers online. So definitely the most important part is saying when somebody visits our website, understands what we can offer, and then replicating that experience in real life. So through the use of the skills that I learned on the course, I am being capable of mirroring those different experiences, those different skills, and making sure that it's a seamless journey, what our customers find when they visit us.
In fact, when I was discussing with Lucrecia, it's a very interesting model, because in the case of The Point, the idea is to merge the two environments, I mean the physical and the digital in one, because at the end of the day, a mall would like its customers to come on site rather than just stick to the online environment. So that's a very interesting model that we're looking at. Can you identify any particular barriers, specifically locally perhaps, that may block or limit someone's ability to start an e-commerce operation?
I would say that the major barrier that people will find is feeling confident to actually do things. I myself was always trying to understand what is the easiest way of going online, of bringing online a service. And through the course, what I can say is that I understood how easy it is. It's a question of learning that you have all the support. Something that the course as well help us understand is the funding available, the resources available, the support that you can have, and the amount of professionals who are there who can help you, one-on-one. So I would say it's this fear of saying, yes, I can do it, yes, I can go for it. I can say that I found this course online, so the way I got in touch with the eWitness course, I saw an advert, I applied for the course, and it definitely completely close the barrier. There are barriers, as you are mentioning, in terms of price, in terms of different other things. However, there is funding supporting you for that as well. So there are programs and there are facilities to proceed. It's mainly just deciding to want to do it.
Thanks, Lucrecia. Now, we're hearing Lucrecia mentioning again the idea of developing skills. And when it comes to develop systems from the ground up, we see a lot of organizations really fall into this trap of chasing for a quick fix, just to go online. We've observed this very much during the peak of the pandemic, where we had a lot of businesses move online, but then all their surrounding systems literally failed to deliver. So they didn't have any back end, they did not even have the logistical support to deliver their product. So they were getting the orders in, but they couldn't bring them or take them to their customers. Calvin, I guess you're involved in this reality on a continuous basis, really. Calvin comes from a web development company. What do you see as being the main pitfalls for someone who is planning on developing a new e-commerce presence from scratch?
What I'd mention, and today it's maybe more relevant given it's a 20-year anniversary, there's a saying where the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. And with COVID and the pandemic, what had happened was a lot of traditional retailers, I think Bernard's presentation showed traditional, born digital, mature. If we were to classify and say the traditional businesses who weren't previously on e-commerce and previously intentionally having a strategy for their online, they may have had to panic act into the reality of the situation brought about by the pandemic. And as Lucrecia just mentioned, there could be indecision if there isn't clarity in how to make a decision. And that clarity comes from having the knowledge and the understanding either in-house, which Lucrecia's went on and done, and through eBusinessify and other such platforms. And there's other ways. It's, as also Bernard mentioned, it is an overwhelming field. So it's a field which one needs to keep very regularly informed, very regularly up to speed, because Facebook, Google are changing their algorithm daily, for example, at least in terms of the search engine. So the key concepts one can learn in a course which is 5 years old. It doesn't mean just because Facebook and Google is changing so fast, you need to have learned something as of today, and what you learn today is old tomorrow. If you learn the key concepts and then can take data-driven decisions, and then a business, no matter if it's traditional, mature, or born digital, it can prosper in e-commerce.
Unfortunately, particularly before the pandemic, we did have some challenges to explain, let's say, to a segment of the business industry the value behind establishing at least an online presence. Interestingly enough, these days the challenge has almost been eliminated, as it became almost a question of life or death for a number of organizations. So at least we try to take something good from something like COVID-19. We've heard about different businesses with diverse needs, essentially at different maturity levels as well. So from your experience, is the typical Maltese business open to adopting to new digital services in general?
I think yes, but when there's maybe a bit of lack of clarity as how to proceed, then guidance is needed or information sought in-house to then know how to take such decisions. There's a bit of a trend for us or for businesses to want to take data-driven decisions. I think as well, I think it was Philippe earlier who mentioned we cannot let technology change our values. And I like that because yes, we need to be data-driven, but to offer value, we need to be customer-centric. And we teach our kids, for example, when they're young and maybe test their resolve for entrepreneurship with like a lemonade stand. And in a lemonade stand, they're very close to the customer, and the customer will advise, like, this lemonade isn't great or something of the sort. And that's key, that we are customer-centric by staying close to the customer, but that doesn't mean obviously being on the shop floor all the time, because that, as we know, is not possible to do. So it's about arming ourselves with the right KPIs and models, and that's maybe, there's no one set way of how to do it, and every single industry would be different. So somebody who can see lots of different industries can guide about how best to measure the business, and then how then to grow the e-commerce efforts and for them to prosper, of course.
Actually, have you seen, let's say, an increase in even requests when it comes to development of new systems since COVID, I mean?
Yes, and technology helps that. Web design and development, as Lucrecia just mentioned, is getting easier. And so the value is in quality and in standing out in the noise. So maybe a couple of years ago here in Malta, to rank first on Google for a particular brand or a particular service was maybe quite easy. And now I think the realization of how important that is has grown. And as you asked, yes, businesses in Malta do understand the value now of their online spaces. So it's easier and maybe easier to understand, and there's more ways of gathering how to go about it. But now there's more people at the party, so to stand out, the value offering and the what's unique about a particular offering really needs to stand out.
Now, with this event being organized by a regulatory authority, one question I had for you as well. Are sellers normally aware of their legal, let's say, legal requirements? I mean, if we consider just the e-commerce directive, you know, that itself mandates that certain information, for instance, is maintained online and it's maintained, updated all the time. But this also goes beyond the e-commerce directive, and for instance, it could touch upon something like GDPR, for instance. What's the level of knowledge in that area?
A bit across the board, across the wall. Like, for example, we often have questions like, are we GDPR compliant? And we can have a whole event about GDPR, of course, which is quite vast. However, you know, the wish to be compliant is there, and knowing that it's important is there, and at least for the topic of GDPR. But, for example, we're very rarely prompted about accessibility, which I know we'll be speaking about very soon. Whereas perhaps when it is a governmental public entity, yes, because the government does a very good job of enforcing certain structures with its regulatory boards. However, maybe in the private sector, I think they're more focused obviously on the business and on the value, and lesser on these aspects. And I think maybe if the businesses can connect more with boards, and as we saw just to the example of Lucrecia and her business, and there's great yield in that, and that would help the whole industry as a whole. I think we as an MCA, there's a goal for it to assist even the laggards, we said, yes, in the industry, and there needs to be a bit of a forum of stores and e-commerce retailers and businesses, because that's how the laggards will kind of become actual players. And really, the big players are not helping the competition by bettering others. It's something which they improve themselves by helping others as well. But with that token, what we often see, which I like to see a lot personally myself, is that large corporation businesses or larger businesses by Malta's standard kind of have like an in-house startup for an online-only business to test out an idea, so to speak. Yeah. And that's obviously has the benefit of a big business, but operates in a smaller way.
Would you have any tips you can share with us? Let's say you have someone who's embarking on a new e-commerce project. What would you think would be, let's say, the top 3 or top 5?
Top would be to get informed. And first and foremost, like I said before, with the example of planting a tree, it's having a strategy. Now, if a business has gone online through panic without that strategy, and there's no harm in taking a spot check, having like an audit review. I like to normally see an e-commerce business which comes to me with a profitability plan. So how every single euro spent in Facebook ads, in Google marketing, Google display ads, search ads. There might not be a strategy for every single element, such as mobile as well. However, the next best time to do that is to do that now. If one is not to inform himself completely and become an expert in the field, then there's lots of help around, and essentially that's it. Strategy and being informed, high level at least, to take key decisions.
Now, one point that always comes back to my mind when we're discussing digital normally is the ever-present security concerns that we hear about. And I'd like the discussion to move a bit actually from e-commerce per se and perhaps into a higher level of related to digital services in general. So we've heard and we continue to hear about high-profile digital security incidents that affect practically all industries, so everyone is pretty much susceptible to these threats. Now, since 2016, the MCA has been implementing the regulation on eID and trust services, which we locally call the eIDAS or eIDAS regulation. And eIDAS is part of security, but it's focused specifically on trust, which we believe is a core component, let's say, of security. Essentially, the aim is to bring the level of trust that people enjoy in the physical world to the digital environment. Riccardo is managing partner at eWitness Malta, which is, in fact, a qualified trust service provider, which we have listed on the Malta Trusted list, which we, in fact, manage. Riccardo, what are your thoughts on the eIDAS regulation in relation, particularly to instilling trust in digital systems?
Yes, thank you for the question. Let's say when the signature directive, that was the previous legislation preceding eIDAS, was written, the point was to allow European providers of certificates and signatures to be able to compete with titans that were at that time RSA and Microsoft. So the whole point of the legislation in Europe, that was first the directive on signatures and then eIDAS, was to create a set of transparent rules and principles that allow also smaller players to be competitive with very big players. And this because in Europe at that time we had only small players. And 20 years ago, when I started to do standardizing these rules into ETSI and SEN standards, committees that I have been chairing over 20 years, if someone would have told me, Riccardo, in 2020, the whole world is going to use European signatures, I would have asked him what kind of drugs he uses, because I want them also. I mean, for being so optimistic, I mean, you really need a good push. And actually, that's what we achieved in these 20 years. So the point of trust is that if you provide, as the eIDAS regulation has provided, a set of supervisory rules and of criteria of security that you can measure on any kind of company. I mean, our company is a fairly small company, but at the same time, spending an interesting amount of money, but something that is affordable for most companies, I would say, you can actually be in the league of the secure and trusted players. So trusted players means players that apply rules that are transparent, known, and verifiable. And that's something that can become even a competitive advantage with respect to titans that have non-transparent and proprietary rules that nobody can assess.
Of course. In fact, you're mentioning your company being this small company, or you can't compare it with certain corporations. Perhaps you can explain a bit the idea behind the preservation services in general for the audience as well.
Well, without... it's a long story, so I have to make it very short. Let's say that we falsely believe that the trust in notaries was a consequence of their ability to certify something. Actually, the trust in written documents is not coming from the notaries, but it's coming from an ancient practice to keep ledgers. And once a merchant was able to prove that he was the true owner of something that he was selling using these ledgers, then, we are speaking of 1,000 years ago, people start to think paper is magic, because you can prove property, which was actually a devilish effort to do at that time. And what I'm trying to say is that a ledger is nothing less than long-term preservation. So the system of trust and of rules on which our society is based was born on long-term preservation. Now we are moving to a digital environment. And the digital environment requires as well long-term preservation for working in the future years, because you can imagine that a society that has no memory of itself is a kind of Frankenstein. So we need to have long-term preservation in order to keep intact the social structure of the world in which we live. And this long-term preservation, in my opinion, must be compliant to open and transparent standards of the kind that the European Union has been writing and is writing still, and that you here and MCA are enforcing.
Actually, how do you think both private and public entities, how could you think they can leverage the opportunities that are brought about specifically by trust services now, by what's in the eIDAS regulation at the moment?
Well, I think to answer very briefly your question, and maybe then I elaborate a bit, the model is the same of the electricity grid or of the train, the railway systems, where the decision was taken to keep the state responsible for keeping up the infrastructure and the companies for providing quality services, added value services on this infrastructure. In principle, this is how it could work in the eIDAS environment. So being very specific, it means that the state provides supervision to ensure that players are playing by the rules. The state may support some less glamorous kind of businesses like broadband, etc., providing the infrastructure for that. Also there, some state support for creating the infrastructure is needed. But on the other side, I believe that, it doesn't come to mind, maybe you can help me in finding it. Was there ever a state app that was appealing? I mean, or a website made by the public hand that was fun to use? I didn't find them, so probably I'm biased, or you have one. Okay, sorry. So Liechtenstein is the exception, for the record.
It was from Qatar. You could pay your traffic fines online, and if you paid within 14 days, you got a 30% discount.
Well, that's not fun, but it's very useful.
But we can do it here as well. So we don't get the discount.
So the point is that I believe that when it comes to put together some elements in which it is necessary a continuous evolving analysis of the business model, of the consumer experience, etc., I don't have any doubt that companies are vastly more efficient and capable of doing this compared to the state. That's where the state should make a step back. You probably know, or if you don't know, it's interesting to know, that before the time of privatization and Thatcherism and Reaganism, in the United Kingdom, the state was owning a chain of hotels. What's the point of having a chain of hotels owned by the state? You know, that's precisely what the state should not do, should be left to the private entrepreneur. Meanwhile, it is very important to build the roads and the railways and the airports that are needed to bring people to the hotels. So I fundamentally think this is how the two elements should be separated and run. Now, the complex part is that if we speak of identities or personal signatures, it's not an easy question to tell who is going to be the entity that better handles these very sensitive aspects. Okay? I think there should the solution that instinctively I would prefer, which is in the proposal of the Commission 281 to rewrite eIDAS that is in the Parliament now, and on the 30th, next Tuesday, there will be the first session of the rapporteurs on this amendment of the regulation. The idea is somehow to find a joint effort between state and private companies in handling identities. But how, I think it's still open to some discussions.
Of course. So in the morning session, we've heard a lot about platforms already, namely marketplaces in this case, and the network effect that they have. So marketplaces can be considered to be a way through which sellers can quickly move to an online operation and avoid certain hurdles. So you have the stock management system already in place, you have the payment gateway in there, it's all there for you. However, we've also heard on how such platform can wield what we refer to normally as a network effect, or the network effect that they have. So in other words, their presence and their potential for influencing both the buyer, but perhaps more so the seller, can bring about threats and damages that the legal and regulatory systems at this point in time cannot really cope so well with. We've also heard mention of the Digital Services Act, which is coming into force in the near future, and the Platform to Business Regulation, which is another example of digital regulation, which is already in effect. We have just actually introduced it into Maltese law a few months ago. Ian, first of all, what are your thoughts in general on the DSA?
Well, I've listened to the previous panels and there were some teething problems. Some of them I concur with and I will not repeat myself. Let's start with the positive. So the DSA, I would say, I would capture it in three phrases. Right now it's a timely piece of legislation. It's coming at the right time, even though
time has come.
It has been now delayed. There's going to be what's not as yet agreed, even the draft. So it's quite timely. It's as well very ambitious, extremely ambitious, okay? Even what it needs to regulate, the fact that it wants to harmonize, okay? It's very ambitious, even particularly within a European context. It is also quite innovative. Innovative, it's not, it's the first time we're regulating. No, the industry was already regulated. However, we had fragmented regulation. Fragmented regulation which is still there. But nonetheless, the European Commission is trying first and foremost to harmonize, to a certain extent, centralize certain regulatory functions, and indirectly, this is going to be a long haul, harmonize as well what member states are trying to do. Because we had countries like, for example, UK before they left, France, Germany, who were already targeting, who were already regulating this sector. So to a certain extent, from that angle, it's a positive piece of legislation. It's positive as well because unlike previous legislations, if you look at the copyright regime, there's a lot of mention and there's a lot as well of embracing of human rights. So human rights, as a matter of fact, we have as well a human right impact assessment, which is specifically mentioned in the legislation, and it takes on as well from the previous work done through eCommerce, information society. To a certain extent, safe harbor provisions, and it boils down to interpretation, to nomenclature, okay, to certain words, how they are going to be interpreted by each respective regulator in the member state. So to a certain extent, for me, it is something which I'm looking forward to. As a lawyer, and I've been working in the industry for quite some time, I think there are going to be problematics whilst we try to regulate this industry.
I can imagine that. To what extent do you expect the DSA and other similar regulation, because as I mentioned, there's other, like the DMA and the Platform to Business and the others that are coming in, to solve any of the issues that we've been discussing?
Well, let's start. What are the issues? Because there are a lot of issues. Let me try to pick on what previous panelists were speaking about. We're speaking about harmful content. We're speaking about illegal content. The DSA per se speaks as well about making reference to this as illegal content which is not harmonized. But at the end of the day, I think we forgot one important tenet here. Because it's easy to concentrate on platforms, it's easy to concentrate on the operators. But at the end of the day, they are using a technology, they are just fueling the user. So the unharmonization on what is illegal, okay? The unharmonization on the fact that, okay, what is illegal online should be illegal offline. Okay, but do you have the same rights? Do you have the same redress? Do you have the same protection? That's territory-wise. Then if you have to extend that from one country to the other, do we have the same nomenclature? Do we have the same laws? No. So even there we have a very big problematic, because you're trying to regulate the elephant in the room, when effectively then, if you're trying to protect the user, you're trying to make the internet a safe environment, you have to go on land-based regulation. And land-based regulation, particularly when speaking about criminal, it's not harmonized. It's a no-touch area to a certain extent. So that is a problem there, because it is the user which fuels hate speech, then it amplifies that on a platform. It is the user to a certain extent who tries to do illegal activities. It's not the gatekeepers, intermediaries, the hosting providers, call them however you want. So,
but of course, the idea here is that the gatekeeper or the provider, they have this network effect, you know. There needs to be some checks and balances. Of course, it's the end user that is actually performing the act. But the idea here is to have a gatekeeper somewhere that could keep tabs on that.
It's still problematic, and they explain why.
It's definitely not perfect.
No, but even the definition. So under the DSA, and I'm going to concentrate on the DSA because the DMA is a little bit different. It's more competition-based.
Yes.
Ex ante, to a certain extent. But under the DSA, you have a classification. So you have intermediaries, you have hosting providers, okay? Then you have platforms and very large platforms. Now, the European Commission wants to address risk. Having 45 million users, it is a risk, but I would say that even having a small operator, a small intermediary, okay, who is not regulated as a very large operator, who, for example, has a particular focus group on hate speech. There, irrespective of the number of users, there's a risk. So why doesn't the European Commission has an instrument, has a particular power within the DSA? Because the European Commission is going to take a very active role, very active, similar to what happens in competition, similar to what's happening under DORA and under MiCA, because we're having now, this is a new wave, okay? So why is the element of risk different? Is it only metered by the amount of users? No. So we need to rethink our strategy there. The element of risk is very important because there you need to address it, particularly when you look as well at the impact assessment. The impact assessment does not address one cardinal thing, migration. And you know it because we regulate telecoms and you regulate financial services, you regulate gaming. When you regulate a company and a particular person who wants to abuse knows that it is regulated, he will migrate. However, what happens when you're applying two different ways and measures and you don't have a measure, a means to redress that, to a certain extent give buoyancy to the regulation? And that is a massive problem.
Yes. In fact, that is apparently one of the major areas of research that the US is doing. So rather than focus solely on numbers, like the 10% of the DSA, they are trying to find other criteria of. Perhaps a final question for you, Ian. What major hurdles do you envisage will need to be overcome for the DSA, in this case, to provide tangible value to society?
Well, I will not tell a lot. I think there's going to be a lot of fragmentation, even though the aim is not to have fragmentation, and even lack of harmonization. So there, I think irrespective of the legislative instrument, the respective member states need to have a common intent, a common positive way forward on how to make the internet a safe place, on how to create more value. And this is as well another problem, because we're trying to regulate here. This is a problem I see even under the AI Act. We're trying to regulate something where Europe is not a leader. So to a certain extent, when you speak about AI, you have China, you have America, Europe is very much behind. If we're speaking about these services, I mean, non-comparable. That is tied as well to access to capital. So if we want the market to flourish, you need to create the perfect conditions so that there is capital flowing, there are innovators, and there is an uptake of service. Now, the question I pose is, with these kind of regulations, particularly stemming from the fact that Europe is still far much behind. Even, for example, the United States invested from 1995, I believe, $1.6 trillion. I mean, comparably, Europe, I think, invested approximately $200 billion. So that's 1/6 or 1/7. So where do we want this to go? Because that's another important tenet. You have a single European market. You need to foster innovation. You need to foster value, because that is a basic tenet for evolution. So that is problematic. We need as well to harness existing legislation. You look at the EDPP, the European Data Protection Supervisor. I mean, apparently he wasn't even consulted. The way his statements were dished, he was not even the EDPP. 2 weeks ago stated very clearly, listen, we need to be involved. It's not just mentioning us. We need to be involved because irrespective of what you do for recommendation system, for profiling, there is the GDPR. It's a regulation. It's already there. So we need to build on that. Yeah. So that is another thing. Then one last point, and this was mentioned as well, and it happens as well in telecoms. When we started regulating telecoms, the regulator did not know as much as the operators. Even I was speaking, even in building a bottom-up cost model, unless you have an operator with you, you never build it up. So it is the same thing. You need to adopt a co-regulatory approach. The regulators here need to be more flexible, more avant-garde, okay? They need to involve the industry as much as possible. It's one thing having a code of practice being self-regulated, but it's another thing, to a certain extent, enforcing it through co-regulation. My last point, and I will close. And I have to say it. I deal a lot in software, as you know. I mean, even in the legislation, we have mentions that you disclose your code. For me, this is total bollocks. Apart from the fact that you have trade secret issues, and it has been flagged several times. But you're a software developer. I will disclose the code to you. What will you get from it? If we are speaking about machine learning, if we are speaking about automation, if we are speaking about AI, irrespective of the nomenclature, so we know that there's going to be a lot of automation. We know that to a certain extent the human is going to have a less prominent position irrespective of the human centricity, is going to have a less prominent position. We want to make sure that we imbue the correct element of trust. So why don't you impose audit not on the company, on the software? Why don't you impose safety by design principles on the software? Why don't you enforce the data protection by design principles, which are already in the GDPR? We are sort of reinventing the wheels when there are already tools over there. So even there, I think we need to start with what we have, and we need to target the element of risk. So only by targeting these that we can bring value.
Quite a lot of challenges there. I guess that would be it from us. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.